Hey YouTube, what is going on? And thanks for checking out the Straight SRT8 YouTube channel where we discuss all things SRT8 related. Now today is part one of a three-part mini-series on brakes. So part one is going to be components, part two is going to be brake installation, and then part three is going to be tips and tricks and debugs. So focusing on part one for today, we're going to get into what is the best brake application for your exact needs, considering the way you drive your vehicle and your budget. So let's compare one-piece rotors versus two-piece rotors. Are they worth the difference? What's actually a pro and con with those? And then get into brake pads. Do you want to use ceramic brake pads? Do you want to use semi-metallics? Or do you want to use organic brake pads? And then how do you pair them all up? Do you use organics with one-piece rotors? Do you use semi-metallics with two-piece rotors? Or how can you kind of mix and match components in order to get the best option for you? So all that data and more coming at you right now on my desktop. So let's get to it. So here we are at my desktop. I have a ton of data from various manufacturers. Before I get into that and get into pricing, let's talk about our pros, cons, risk, and some comments associated with one-piece rotors versus two-piece rotors. Then we're going to hop into different kinds of brake pads, looking at ceramics, semi-metallics, and of course organic brake pads. So let's start off with one-piece rotors. So one of your pros here is really cost. They are a single piece of forged material, however it may be created, but it's a single piece of material. There isn't two different assemblies, so you're saving on labor, saving on material sourcing, etc. So very budget friendly for a single piece rotor. However, when you get into some of your cons, because it's a single piece, you have much heavier weight. Now, weight plays a very big role, depending on your requirements for driving, but a very big role in horsepower to the ground, so wheel horsepower, and of course, acceleration, deceleration, and drivability. So when we're talking about weight, rotational mass has a much larger impact on forces to a car versus static weight. So we get into, usually it's a 2-to-1 or a little bit better ratio. So for every pound you shave in rotational mass, and by that I mean your wheels, your tires, your rotors, your drive shafts, etc., anything that's physically rotating, by removing some of that weight, you're actually going to have a larger impact in reduction for static weight. So say you shave 10 pounds in your brakes, you're actually shaving 20 pounds of static weight at a minimum. So that in of itself is a big difference. I'm talking about horsepower. The less weight you got to spin around, the more horsepower goes to the ground. So the greater real horsepower you're going to have. And of course, for drag cars, that's extremely important. Now, independent of both of those things, when talking about weight, let's talk about some quick physics for a second. Cars like to go straight. Nothing ever likes to change direction. So by moving your car to left or to right from going straight, you get that body roll because your car's trying to keep pulling straight. The same thing happens with tires. Now, when you have less rotational mass, your car is easier and more nimble moving left and moving right, which has less forces trying to pull it straight. So you're going to get better cornering abilities out of the vehicles and less pull from the tires or less feel from the pulling of the tires and the steering wheel. So weight makes a very, very big difference when it comes to certain driving types. Now, heat dissipation also plays a very large role too. So the goal here for heat dissipation is to remove as much excess heat as possible, keeping rotors nice and cool. Now, when you have traditional one-piece rotors, your outer rotor portion, which is called an outer ring for two-piece assemblies, but for brakes, your outer rotor gets extremely hot. That obviously contacts your brake pads. You get a lot of friction there. You get a lot of heat. That heat then goes inward towards the inner hub and then comes back out towards the rotor. And so you have to get warpages. So you have a very, very hot rotor, a very cool inner ring, and then that causes slight warpages over time, which is going to cause your rotor itself to become warped. And by having a warped rotor, of course, you end up having accelerated wear on your actual rotor itself, which then causes more wear on your brake pads and causes less life, more of a shaking feeling too. So heat dissipation is a huge, huge issue for brake rotors and of course for brake pads as well. So you want to make sure you dissipate as much heat as possible. Now, some of your risks there, again, get into warped rotors because your rotors aren't designed as well as two-piece rotors in terms of heat dispersion. So you do get some heat expelled out of the vehicle, but not on crazy speeds. So that makes one-piece rotors a great option for daily drivers or for occasional street fun. And by occasional street fun, I mean having some fun, in the street, but not going anything crazy. So for SRTs, they weigh quite a bit. They're very heavy vehicles. Whether you have the Jeeps or you have the Chargers or Challengers, Durangos, whatever it may be, they're very heavy vehicles. So even doing typical daily driving, you're gonna get your brakes very hot just typical daily driving. So as soon as you add in that spirited driving in there, they get extremely hot and that starts causing warpages. However, if it's very minimal racing or street fun, then you should be fine. But when you get into more extreme racing, then one-piece rotors are definitely not for you, which brings us to two-piece rotors. So some of the pros here are cost weight reduction. We talked about that previously, and excellent heat dissipation. So these two-piece rotors have an inner hub and an outer rotor, and the outer rotor maintains all that heat, and it's designed to have maximum airflow through it to dissipate a lot of that heat. But when it can't, it holds that heat in the rotor itself, does not bring it forward into the hub, which can cause warpages. So it maintains it in the outer ring only of the rotor. And again, because they are designed better for heat dissipation, you get more airflow through them and they cool down a lot faster, which again, is excellent. Now that yields itself to longer rotor life. So less warpages means longer rotor life. So while they do cost more, they do have benefits in terms of heat reduction, weight reduction, and it costs longer rotor life. Now, your only con associated with two-piece rotors over one-piece rotors is just cost. There is no other negative associated with two-piece rotors besides the hit to the wallet and hit to the budget. And same thing goes for the wrist. There is no other negative besides just that hit. Now, when you're talking about what rotor is best for you, it really depends on your driving style. So if you're going to look at maintaining the fastest acceleration possible, you want to have minimized weight reduction. In order to maintain the quickest 60 to 0 speed for braking, you want to have the minimal rotational mass in your vehicle. In order to maximize horsepower to the ground, you want to have the least amount of weight possible. If you're looking at trekking the car, going on an actual oval track, or involving some cornering, then you want to have the least amount of rotational mass in your car as possible as well. So that makes these an excellent option for spirited drivers who have more fun than occasional street fun, for die-hard racers, and of course road warriors who really get out there and go at it, and especially those who are tracking their vehicles. So again, depending on your requirements, that's going to drive you towards a one-piece rotor or a two-piece rotor. Now that set aside, let's hop into brake pads. So there are three major kinds of brake pads. We have our ceramics, we have semi-metallics, and we have, of course, organic brake pads. So for ceramics, they have excellent bite. So they have a high coefficient of friction, which means when you press that pedal, you're going to feel that nice tight grip on the rotors, and they're going to slow the vehicle drastically, which is excellent. That's what brakes are for. Excellent heat dissipation as well. So a great combination with two-piece rotors because they allow for minimal weight and excellent heat dissipation and excellent rotor life. Now some of your cons here are they're very expensive, but that's not your only con. Because of their high operating temperature that's required, they tend to squeal quite a bit. So when we're talking about ceramic brake pads, they're designed for track cars, or they initially designed for track cars. They're designed for a very high operating temperature, and then once they get very, very warm, they act perfectly fine. But until then, they start to squeal and get a little bit noisy, which makes them a great option for racing. That's why they come standard on a lot of race cars, like truly performance race cars. You get ceramic brake pads. You also get two-piece rotors. You get carbon fiber rotors, carbon ceramic rotors. So again, minimizing weight, maximizing coefficient of friction for braking power, great option for racing vehicles. Now for SRTs, we're going to lean more towards semi-metallic pads. Now I have a ton of data to go over this in a minute on pricing, but for right now, depending on the brand, you can get excellent bite too. Maybe not as great as you could for ceramics, but you still get very excellent coefficient of friction, excellent bite on your semi-metallic brake pads. And they have excellent heat dissipation too. Not quite as good as ceramics, but still very, very good. Of course, manufacturer dependent. Now, some of your cons here is that because they are semi-metallic, they're going to be more aggressive on the rotors. They're going to cause decreased rotor life. Now, this goes one-on-one with driving style. If you drive very aggressively, you're going to have a very aggressive effect on the life of your rotors. I'm using semi-metallic pads versus occasional street fun. You get longer life out of your rotors. That's just common sense. So your risk for semi-metallics is a cost. It's a higher cost for greater pads. So with anything, you get what you pay for. You pay for a cheaper version of semi-metallic pads, you probably get less life out of them, less bite out of them, but they're cheaper. Versus higher end ones like Demon Performance, you get better life out of them, high coefficient of friction, and an excellent option which is low dust. So talking about dust, ceramics, very, very minimal brake dust. Semi-metallics, a little bit more brake dust, not as minimal as ceramics, but not as bad as organics. So that makes semi-metallic brake pads an excellent option for SRT owners because they combine excellent affordability with coefficient of friction and heat dissipation. So very, very good combination for SRTs that are not meant to be drag raced all the time. So for organic brake pads, these are extremely quiet. They're by far out of these three the quietest option because they are so soft. So they don't last very long. And because they're soft and they wear down quickly, a lot of that wearing comes on the brake pad side, not the rotor side. So it gives you very, very long rotor life, very minimal brake pad life, and of course lots and lots of brake dust. That's going to occur from the pads being so soft and wearing down pretty quickly. They also have a lower bite or low coefficient of friction in comparison to semi-metallics and ceramics. For this reason, they are definitely not recommended, at least I do not recommend them for SRTs, because they are not optimized for SRTs. So based on what I just talked about, your best option for your street fun and occasional racing is semi-metallics, and then for full-blown racing and trekking, you want ceramic pads. And then again, one-piece rotor versus two-piece rotors, kind of covered that already. So that being set aside, let's move on to actual pricing and comparison of pricing. So I have over here in my Excel sheet tons of data looking at different manufacturers, and I broke it out into a series of graphs. So our first graph is looking at the one-piece rotors. So let's say you're a spirited driver, occasional, but you mostly use your vehicle for DD. Let's look at your setup. So one-piece rotors for fronts and rears, for a full set of just rotors. We're comparing R1 Concepts, comparing DBA, Disc Brace Australia, comparing EBC and Stop Tech. So ranging these top two are considered by and large the best, R1 Concepts and DBA, around $1,200 or so for a set of front and rear rotors, and then dropping to $930 and $830 roughly for EBC and Stop Tech. So again, these are very popular brake rotors on many, many forums. A lot of guys recommend R1 Concepts. They've had great success with them. A lot of guys really like DBAs as well for single piece rotors. EBC is good, not quite as good as these two. And then Stop Tech also is pretty on par with EBC. A lot of forum members recommend going with Stop Techs as well. So comparing for single piece rotors only, you can expect to pay this much, and this is current as of today. So we're at 8/21 of 2022. These are the most current pricing for them. Now, keep in mind that we are at the tail end of COVID, so we have higher demand, we have lower supply for a lot of these components, so pricings will be a little bit inflated. So expect these prices to drop down in the subsequent months towards the later end of this year. So let's say you're not a one-piece rotor guy. Let's say you're more of a two-piece rotor person. Now we have different prices here for combinations of two-piece rotors. So I stuck to two major brands for the purposes of this graph because there's a lot of data here. It's very, very busy. So I talked about DBA and I talked about Demon Performance. These are by and large the two best options out there for two-piece rotor assemblies. So let's walk through some of the different combinations to let you guys get a better idea for what I'm talking about for the cost of a true two-piece setup. So for DBA, we have that, again, for two-piece rotors, you have an outer ring and you got inner hub. They're very independent pieces. They can be purchased together initially for the first purchase, and after that, what I call a refresh kit is just buying this outer ring. So comparing Demon Performance to DBA, there's quite a bit of difference here, $1,149 versus $952. So both of these are just the outer ring for both fronts, left and rights. Decent price difference here. And then again, the DBA versus Demon Performance, and this is just for the front. For left and rights, this is the outer ring and the hub. So you can see pricing difference here is pretty drastic. But you can look at it right here, your DBA with the outer ring and hub, $1,149 drops to $952, just buying the ring for a refresh kit. And then for Demon Performance, your outer ring and hub is at $1,679, and it drops down to $1,149 after just having the outer ring purchased. So decent price savings there, looking at the initial buy versus refresh buys down the road. Then we get into pricing for both fronts and rears, and for both fronts and rears. So one thing to keep in mind is that Demon Performance is a true two-piece front and rear rotor, while DBA has a two-piece front but a single-piece rear. So looking at your pricing difference here, you're at $1,900 for Demon Performance outer rings. Again, this is just a refresh kit. And then for DBA, you get a refresh kit for the front, but your rears are going to be purchased again because they are single-piece rotors. So decent price difference there. And then we get into down here, your total cost. We're looking at the cost of outer ring plus hub, so one-time buy, initial buy for fronts and rears, and Demon Performance outer rings and hubs. So again, whole assembly, one-time buy, fronts and rears. So you're at almost $3,000 versus 1,700. Again, keep in mind this is a two-piece rotor front and rear. This is a two-piece rotor front, single-piece rotor rear. So quite a bit of a difference there looking at your different options for replacing components. They get pretty expensive. You're pushing about $3,000 right here for a full setup for brakes. And this is just rotors, not including rotors and pads. So now let's hop over into brake pads. We talked about one-piece rotors, talked about two-piece rotors, talked about different costs. What kind of costs do we have and options for brake pads? So again, this is all based on data I pulled from various different forums. So the Wagner thermal quiets were a very popular option, along with the R1 concepts, and then the Power Stop Z26s. These are very popular options for single-piece rotors. These are more popular options for dual rotors. However, they can be swapped interchangeably, of course. So we'll get into the EBC yellow stuff. Quite a bit difference here in pricing. We're looking at $100 roughly for these options. Jump into $400, and then over here we're looking into $500 for brake pads. And these are all around, so it includes fronts and rears. So pretty expensive. Definitely a large difference between Demon Performance and Brembo's comparison to Power Stops, your R1 concepts, and your Wagner thermal quiets. This is a true case where you get what you pay for. You want higher-end racing pads, Demon Performance, you're going to pay for it. You want lower-end pads that are still functioning very well, but they're not quite designed for racing the way these ones are. And of course, you're going to have a little bit cheaper of an option there for brake pads. Not saying these are bad, just saying they are different in the way they perform, and of course, you get what you pay for. So we talked about rotors and brake pads. Let's look into actual brake kits now. So this is buying front rotors, front pads, rear pads, all in. So Demon Performance two-piece rotors, front and rear, and Demon Performance pads, looking at $3,500. DBA, two-piece fronts for rotors, one-piece rear rotors with pads, and these actually come with Demon Performance pads, looking at $2,200. And then it dropped down to around $1,000 or so for single stage or single piece rotors. So you have DBA fronts and rears, single rotors with pads, around $1,190. And then your EBC fronts and rears with pads, and then your Hawk Performance fronts and rears with pads. Now these are by far the most popular combinations of rotor and brake assemblies out there. However, of course, there are certain people who decide to go with Wagner thermal quiets, your R1 concept, and your Power Stops as well. So looking at, this is full pricing. Let's look at refresh pricing. So keep in mind this pricing. Let's hop over here to refresh pricing. This is the cost of just buying refresh parts, which means that for Demon Performance, you're buying 4 new outer rotors, no hubs, and just buying brake pads. For Demon Performance, for Demon Performance, this is your actual pricing to comparing the two. So you have your Demon Performance all in at $3,500, and this is your refresh cost. So this is buying just refreshed pads with the outer ring. So you're saving about $1,000 there, and that's the cost of the hubs. So you're not buying 4 hubs for this option. So your initial cost is $3,500, and then your cost there and after is $2,400 for a whole new set. Same thing goes for a DBA. For your DBA, keep in mind 2-piece rotors up front, 1 piece in the rears with pads, $2,200 initial cost, and then $1,900 there and after, because you're not buying those 2 front hubs anymore that you buy in this initial setup. And these hubs are designed to be used again and again and again, so there's no need to buy it every single time. So huge cost savings here, dropping this down quite a bit. And then here, cost savings, but not as substantial as it is for Demon Performance. So now let's look at the cost of refreshed parts for 2-piece rotors versus brand new 1-piece rotors. So here we have on the left, these are our 2 refreshed pieces. We have our DBAs and we have Demon Performance. And this is the cost of buying 1-piece rotors again. So this is a whole inclusive cost, buying pads and rotors for the front and rears, left and right, for comparing 2-piece refresh versus 1-piece buys. So still higher cost here. So you're about $1,200 or so roughly for these options. This is about $700 more, and this is about double what you're paying over here. So 2-piece rotors, definitely, even with the refresh costing, is quite a bit higher than buying single-piece rotors for your fronts and rears. So all in, we talked about 2-piece rotors, talked about 1-piece rotors. And we talked about different kinds of brake pads, different combinations, the costing of all of them, caution of refresh brakes versus new brakes, and then of course different options there are out there on various different forums for preferred options by different members. So awesome summary for you guys. That is it for this video. We're going to hop into doing a brake installation next as part of our part 2 of our 3-episode mini series on brakes. So as always, guys, if you got questions, please drop them below. Let's get a discussion started. And then this pricing is, as I told today, as of 8/21, very, very relevant. Now, I did go with this option right here. I went with the DBA 2-piece setup, not the refresh kit, but the initial buy, of course, for my Jeep SRT. And I purchased it from Solus Racing. So when I started doing this research, I had a hard time finding companies that offered both brake pads and rotors at good pricing. They were responsive to my questions. It's very hard to find brakes for our SRTs. So I came across this company, Solus Racing. Now, they're not sponsoring this video by any means, but I did work with them to buy my brake pads and buy my rotors. And the website is pretty awesome. When you look into doing brakes real quick, if you hover over here to looking at brakes, we'll go into doing brakes for our SRTs. So we're going to scroll down to brake kits. And this is being fronts and rears and pads. And then look at the Jeep SRTs. And they give you a bunch of different options here. So they have pricing for your DBAs, they have pricing for Demon Performance, EBCs, and your Hawk Performance brakes as well. So they don't sell cheap parts. They sell truly performance-grade material, and not just for brakes, but for other options as well, for SRTs and other vehicles too. But they are a great resource. I use them for my buy. I'm definitely going back to them again. I think they're an excellent option, and if you guys wouldn't mind supporting them, I know they'd appreciate it. But that is it for this video, guys. If you got questions, as always, drop them below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for checking out the Straight SRT YouTube channel.